that's where it comes together.
But that process of actually being in the landscape and of finding routes through the landscape and of understanding the maps and the topography of the landscape, quite apart from actually trying to capture it in two dimensions, has been a really important part of your life, hasn't it?
Yeah, so that's my personal background. I've got my father who's here today, who's one of Australia's sort of pioneering rock climbers, and I grew up in that tradition. My mother was kind of a pioneering bushwalker, and so I grew up in that tradition from when I was a kid. And so that idea of, I had a sense of how to be in the landscape, particularly the wilderness landscape, and how to navigate, how to survive, how to kind of feel comfortable in certain wild environments. And that, I think, kind of forms how you look. You're in a landscape, you're looking in terms of how you're going to be in it, rather than just looking as a tourist how you're going to see it as a scene. So you can kind of be somewhere and the far off mountain peak doesn't just feel like, well, that looks nice. It's like, well, how do you get from there to there? How do you move around that? How do you kind of like engage with it? So I think that background filtered into how I work.
And so what were some of the art traditions, the schools that you started exploring either as a student or beyond, that allowed you to bring together that kind of essence for the landscape? What were some of the landscape traditions that made sense to you?
Well, I guess what worked out, and this took me a while to work out, and this wasn't until well after I'd left art school that I kind of worked out how a number of different traditions came together. Because I guess what I was saying is I inherited that romantic tradition, and then felt somewhat like, well, we're in a postmodern period. We can't really get into the sublime. That's kind of embarrassing. We have to critique it.
Sublime embarrassment. That's
exactly. That's right. And I knew I wasn't engaging with it on that level. So I come from that tradition. But then the expressionist tradition, which kind of there's an English component to and a Northern European component to, that influenced me as well. The American kind of abstract expressionist tradition, obviously the Australian landscape sort of 20th century tradition, particularly Fred Williams as a standout. But then adding all into the mix of that, not so much as just a direct influence. I'm not a scholar in this, but as an understanding of my work, looking at Chinese brush painting as well. And that, to me, bringing all that together, I understood that what works for me is that I'm naturally a very expressive artist, but then there's a stillness and a waiting and in between these kind of periods of high energy and high anxiety sort of thing. And that all of those traditions together I could take something from, and in a way still engage with aspects of the sublime, not critique it, but not actually just be a passive observer of it as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned that stillness and that waiting, because having been on a couple of trips into the landscape with you while you've been working, it's interesting to observe Tim, because you spend a lot of time walking and exploring and actually not painting or drawing. And then something seems to happen. There's a right moment for you to start. Can you describe what's going on in your mind and what you're seeing and how you're finding that right moment and that right place to start?
It's hard to articulate it, but there's definitely a feeling of I'm not just going to start a work, or particularly with some of these plain. If I'm going to do a little study, just for a sketch, fine. But if I'm going to start a work where I'm trying to create a finished work, I need to see or understand how I'm going to see the landscape, how I'm going to respond to it. And in the sublime tradition, it's the Edmund Burke sort of quite, the beautiful terror of the landscape. Now that relates to kind of a religious overview, but just that sense of being not necessarily on these trips because we never are that far away, but being in the genuine wilderness environment, being a long way away from everyone and everything, and a sense of aloneness and a sense of being by yourself that does give rise, I think, to a level of anxiety. At the same time, you're absolutely loving it, and like this is where you want to be. And I think that combined, like a sense of, and it seems completely schizophrenic. Maybe I've just got some issues, but that idea of having complete stillness and acceptance, and this like high energy as well. And it's just trying to put both of those into the landscape so you can move through it and kind of have areas of peace. And in the process of me creating it, I'm doing like a fully kind of non-stop, no thinking 5 minutes, but then stopping and pulling back, looking and thinking.